Hey, friends, welcome back for another evening of our walk through the Gospel of Matthew. I don't know if walk is the right word. I feel like we're more to crawl, but we are getting close to the end. I am trying to decide the best way um, to kind of wrap this up as we kind of change our summer schedule a little bit starting in July. For those of you who are local, you probably know, heard announced, seen it read, that we're doing some joint stuff with Sunrise on Wednesday nights this summer. So instead of video class, we'll be doing some things in person. Um, so that either means that I'm going to hit pause on this or drop videos different night of the week. I don't want to wait 2 months to finish, so we'll kind of figure it out as we go. And once I kind of know how I'm going to proceed, I'll let you know here on video. We've got one more Wednesday before I have to make a decision, so I'm going to use that time to figure out how to best do this. And you can give me some feedback if you'd like about if there's a different day of the week you want these videos to drop on. There are a number of options. So if you've got an idea, throw it my direction, and it'll either work or it won't. We'll see. For tonight, we are continuing on with the trial after the arrest of Jesus and the trials of Peter and Judas. We have really 3 trials in this short time frame, and that's how we're going to read them. I think it's important that we pay attention to the ways in which all 3 of them respond and compare and contrast Peter's reaction to his trial to that of Jesus, and then Judas's trial of sorts to that of Peter's, and see what we can take away for ourselves in this process. So, for tonight, we are in chapter 26, verses 57, chapter 26, verse 57 through 27:10. So 26:57 through 27:10. So what we're going to do, what we've done the last several weeks now, is just pause the video and you go ahead and read that stretch of scripture on your own, and then we'll come back and I will work my way through discussing kind of point by point as we go. There are a number of things that we talked a lot about in Matthew that show back up again tonight. Anyway, pause the video, read through chapter 26, verse 57 through chapter 27, verse 10, and then unpause the video and we will continue on. And we're back. Deep down, I know that there are at least a handful of you that aren't reading, and so that short clip just feels fun to me every time. Anyway, chapter 26, verse 57 gives us Jesus's trial. So he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's taken back to the high priest's house, and here we have kind of an interesting. The whole thing is interesting. The average trial would not take place at the high priest's house, but it is late at night. If you pay attention to how they have been processing this, their search for witnesses and trying to put together a case has been ongoing. They're not doing this at the last minute. So it's very likely that those who go and do the arresting have been sent by the high priest, who has been doing this other work on the side. It is the Passover. It's late at night. They're not going to be in the temple. It's not likely a gathering of the full Sanhedrin, which is something like 71 different people from various main, groups of the Sadducees and of the priests and of Jerusalem's leading families. It's very likely just a smaller collection, the core of those who were involved, but it may be all of them. The high priest would have had quite a large house. Jesus is taken back. And one of the things that Matthew says is that they were looking to find witnesses. False testimony is the phrase. My translation, the New Living Translation, I don't think does a good job of it. What they said is to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus. But that's not actually the goal. And I believe the description of the testimony as false comes from Matthew. They're not looking for false testimony. They firmly believe that Jesus is guilty. They firmly believe that there is true testimony out there. It is only false in the eyes of Matthew, Jesus, the early church, in that what they're looking for. And the other interesting point here is the the accusation that they level against Jesus comes from something Jesus says in Matthew's gospel. Now, it may be a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of what Jesus says, but Jesus did claim that the temple would be torn down and he would rebuild it in 3 days. Now, again, they don't understand the greater point that he's making, but it forms the basis of the accusation that gets leveled against him. The testimony itself is not untrue, even if its application is. They're looking for evidence that they firmly believe exists. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. I don't want to try and make a comparison to really to anything else. This is an incredibly unique experience. Now, I say all that to say maybe a good comparison is no, not really. I was going to say the kid in class who you always know is at the middle of stuff. Like Jesus was always at the middle of something. And so they've decided there's something nefarious about it. They've decided that he's guilty. And so therefore they go searching for the evidence they know must exist in order to prove themselves right. Maybe that's a good description. And so they come up with enough. What's really interesting, too, is that Jesus is taught in the Sermon on the Mount against taking oaths. The high priest tries to force him in this passage into an oath. The priest himself puts him under oath. I demand in the name of God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus doesn't bite. Jesus does not take an oath one way or another. And he responds kind of vaguely. Vague isn't the right word. It's an affirmation of what the priest has said, but he does so very much on his own terms. Like he's not going to play the priest's game, if that makes sense. And so Jesus says, it's as you've said it. And then he makes an additional messianic claim. It says, you will play witness. Essentially, you will see the Son of Man seated in the power at God's right hand and coming on the cloud of heavens. That's enough for the high priest and for the room. That is a blasphemous statement from their perspective. And if Jesus were not who he claimed to be, it would be a blasphemous statement. And so the high priest tears his clothes. I mean, they have in their minds followed all of the requirements to come to this point. Levitical law requires 2 witnesses in order to form a death penalty. They found 2 witnesses whose statements corroborate each other. Those statements are true. This is something Jesus said. They may have misunderstood it, but it is something Jesus said. So the high priest tears his clothes. Jesus, very much like Isaiah's suffering servant, does not offer a real defense. In his case, to say, no, I didn't say that, would be a lie. He could have tried to offer a different interpretation, tried to explain what he meant, but he also knows that it doesn't matter for these people. While that is going on, which makes it fun, Peter is in the courtyard. So this is not like chronological events. These are pieces of things that are all happening at the same time. So while Jesus is being questioned, Peter is in the courtyard being questioned. And he's not being questioned by the high priest. He's being questioned by the high priest's maid. But he's not standing in front of the Sanhedrin. He's standing in front of, well, they're essentially their servants, their wives, their children, like that, maybe wives. That's his crowd. The wealthiest people in Jerusalem kind of had a courtyard area that their houses all surrounded. The area out front would have been a common space. It would have been populated by people who were connected to those families in some way or another. So you have the greater trial and the lesser trial, essentially. And I also want to point out what Peter is accused of. He's essentially accused of being a Galilean, guilty by association. He was with Jesus, sure, but what gives him away, for lack of a better phrase, is his accent. And this is actually something we kind of know at the time. The Galilean accent of Aramaic was kind of looked down upon. His accent gives him away as a Texas expatriate here living in the Pacific Northwest. I understand this feeling intimately. Um, and so Peter is there. They accuse him and he denies it. They accuse him again. He denies it. And then, unlike Jesus, who will not be put under oath and will not swear by anything, having taught against this, Peter then puts himself under oath and swears by and curses. And the statement of the curse is vague, but based on context, what seems likely there is not that he calls down a curse on himself, even though most translations choose that route. It is at least as likely, if not more likely, that he calls down a curse on Jesus. And of course, this is the moment where the trial is finishing up. Jesus is being led away. We hit that time of cock crow, which we talked about last week, which is like a normal changing hour, often a time where roosters begin to crow. And Jesus and Peter make eye contact, and that is too much. That's too much for Peter. He recognizes that, and there's more to be said here. Coming out of this garden experience where Jesus prayed for strength and Peter slept through the opportunity to pray for strength, where like all of these moments, what you see is Jesus' consistent, steadfast faithfulness versus Peter's lackadaisical, self-interested, lazy faith. So Jesus is prepared for this moment, and Peter is not. And I think in much wider settings, we recognize that people have breaking points. There are things that we cannot imagine ourselves experiencing or doing, and we'll do any number of things to avoid being in that position, including lying, cheating, what Peter does here. Peter, however, unlike us and many times, is kind of forced into a moment of reckoning right in the middle of his trial. And so he bails. His grief and despair, not only from what he has just done, but also from what is happening to Jesus and what has happened in the last little bit, is all just entirely too much. Remember, this is the Peter who not all that long ago was willing to whip out a sword and go to war on behalf of Jesus. And now he's alone in isolation, weeping bitterly. And while those two things are going on, you have Judas. Or maybe a little bit after those things happen, because Judas finds out that the ultimate aim of the people with whom he worked was not to discredit Jesus, something that Peter seemed to be on board with, but to put him to death, something that Judas is not on board with. I may have said Peter just a second. Judas. We're talking about Judas. Judas. And so the moment that Judas realizes that this is actually going to cost Jesus his life is a moment that Judas cannot stomach. And so he goes back and he tries to undo what he's done. And I'll be honest, I've read through the story of Judas so many times that it becomes a background story, really. It's oh yeah, and Judas was that terrible person who messed up. And then I came to the point where I recognize, Judas denied, Peter denied, and what makes a difference is how they respond to it. But then you get this, where if you're paying attention, like, Judas works hard to some extent to undo what he has created, because he recognizes that what is happening is not right. Now, I don't know that what this means is that Judas in this moment understands that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. I think, you can take this with a grain of salt, but I think, based on what I know, that Judas falls into that crowd of people who wanted a political Messiah, somebody who was going to kick the Romans out and establish Israel as a nation again. And when it became obvious to him, maybe more so than it was to anybody else, give Judas some credit here for seeing something. When it becomes obvious that that's not what Jesus is doing, then Judas wants to get Jesus out of the way to make room for what he would term the real Messiah. Jesus is now a pretender, and that's not helpful, but I don't think he knew that what he was betraying him to was death. And that quite literally kills Judas, because he does not know how to reconcile what he's done. Maybe this is the way to say it. He may not have been a fan of Jesus as Messiah, but he sure seems to like Jesus as a person. And this moment is too much for Judas. And so he declares, as much as he can, that it's a sham trial. He declares Jesus to be innocent. He proclaims his own guilt and his own sin. Remember, bearing false witness, not exactly smiled upon in Jewish law. And it's all to no avail. And we may get a follow-up story about this field, and that in some ways connects to two different passages from the prophets, one from Jeremiah and one from Zechariah, neither of which say what Matthew turns it into here. And this is a reminder that Matthew does not treat prophecy the way that we do. I think what Matthew does with prophecy from the Old Testament in the story of Jesus, I've talked about this a number of times, but it's been a bit, and this is by way of reminder. Matthew's notion of prophecy, of fulfillment of prophecy, is more about finding out how God has worked and showing how God continues to work in that way. So showing reflections and flashes and pictures of remember this, now this. Because neither Jeremiah nor Zechariah nor anyone else in the prophets claims that the Messiah will be sold for 30 pieces of silver. Instead, we have these two stories where not even necessarily people. Man, it's hard to. I got to give Matthew some credit here because it's hard to conflate these two stories perfectly. But there's some connection, and Matthew builds the connection of the two into one, and then compares it to Jesus, essentially to say God was working here. Now, what we do with prophecy is we try to go back in the prophets and find one-to-one connections. This means this, and this means this. In other words, what Matthew really sees, how Matthew reads much of the prophets, is implicitly messianic. Not because it's talking about the Messiah, but because it's talking about how God works, and God works through the Messiah, Jesus the Christ in the first century. Maybe that's the best way to explain how Matthew does this. There's a reason that Matthew makes all of these connections that some of our other gospel writers don't. And I think part of it comes from how he reads and how he then connects Jesus to the prophets. I'll pause to say I understand that might be a little bit confusing. Now is not a good format for me to try to explain it because it's more of a Q&A and you can't really queue. So if you want to talk more about what I mean by that or how I see that, please email me, talk to me after church, stop by the office. Because again, I think Matthew tries to make apparent in as many ways as he can that Jesus the Christ is the ongoing work of God manifest in the flesh. And so he pulls all of these points of connections to do it in a way that we don't necessarily do. So there we go. That's what I'll end on for now. But anyway, back to Judas. For Judas, it's all just a little bit too much. And he finds no hope at the end of his betrayal, so he ends his own life. And really, outside of that, the actions of Peter and Judas are not all that different. There's some mechanical differences there, but if if Peter is cursing Jesus by the end of that moment, then you're in Judas territory. Um, so, uh, the question for Matthew's readers is really, I think, how do I respond? One of the commentaries I read told the story of a of a church that decided they were going to build a small um, chapel specifically for prayer. And inside it, they put 12 chairs, one for each of the disciples, and did some name engraving. And the fascinating point that the commentary makes is the chair that is most worn out, so figuring the chair that has been sat in most, is the one inscribed to Judas. I think there are deeply personal connections we can make with Judas and with Peter and with James and John, and like I get why people make some connections, but there's obviously something about the deeper sense of betrayal and despair that Judas experiences that we connect with at various points in life. I would hope, however, that we can see beyond the despair that Judas does. I don't know that what Peter has is hope. I don't think that's it. But he does have some ability to persevere. And sometimes that's all we can ask for, is to see tomorrow. And Peter sees tomorrow when Judas doesn't. And that puts him in a position for redemption. All right, we've already gone longer than I wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and call it here. Be back next week with more of chapter 27. We'll see you then.